the Executive Director of International Programs here at the University of Evansville. He's responsible for facilitating collaboration across academic and non-academic offices to advance international engagement of students, faculty, and staff on the Evansville campus and at international sites. Previously, he served as Director of the International Studies Program and Chair of the Department of Law, Politics, and Society. Professor Milner's international experience includes serving as a visiting professor several times at both Harlaxton College and Tokugawa University in, I'm going to butcher this name, Shizuoka, Japan, as well as research travel in Europe, Asia, Latin America, and Eastern and Southern Africa. He was also a visiting professor with the University of Virginia's Semester at Sea, circumnavigating the globe in just over 100 days. Milner's career began in Washington, D.C., where he spent several years as a researcher for a government contractor, working closely with a number of security and intelligence agencies. As a professor, his primary teaching role has focused on international relations courses, such as international law and organization, U.S. foreign policy, human rights, and politics of the global economy. His research, which integrates globalization and broadly defined aspects of human rights, has appeared in Human Rights Quarterly, the Journal of Private Enterprise, Sociological Quarterly, International Studies, and a number of edited volumes. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Milner.
Thanks so much, Gabriella, and thanks to everyone that's contributed to this. I've been overwhelmed, I think is not an overstatement, over the last couple of months, seeing what Scholars for Syria has done. I mean, in terms of grassroots, it's just been remarkable. Definitely hats off to Gail Vignola and Elisa Kratz, as well as so many, I mean, literally scores and scores of folks, both on campus and off, and obviously our Syrian students who have really inspired all of us. I was humbled when Gabriella and her group asked me to do this, because if you look at the next few speakers, they're probably infinitely more qualified to talk about Syria than I, because I've said, I've been to the Middle East, I've traveled, I've done some research, but I don't do Syria in terms of my area. I do broad aspects of global human rights and international trade and globalization, but I have a huge interest in it. So, nor am I a historian. So even though I'm going to kind of dance through a lot of history, and I've told my Syrian colleagues that if you hear something that you say, wait a minute, that is just totally wrong, then jump in here, because it's all, as I tell students, we're all learning. Definitely, since we're looking at historical and political aspects, there are heated aspects of that. I try to split the difference as we're going through here, but I know at the end we'll have some great questions, and indeed we'll have some well-heeled Syrians who can actually feel those much better than I. If you look at well, what's happened over the last 5 years, and really it has been 5 years since the Arab Spring. 5 years ago this spring, Dan Byrne and I were on a panel of saying, oh my gosh, what's going on here, right? I mean, we've seen this amazing contagion that started with a young man, Bouazizi, in Tunisia, setting himself on fire, and both figuratively and literally, we saw going through the Middle East and North Africa this swell of democratization. You know, most of the world said, this is great, this is fantastic. Some political scientists and foreign policy folks said, okay, that may be great, but if you look at political vacuums, or if you look at revolutions or upheavals, there will be winners and losers, and more than likely there's going to be an inordinate amount of pain. Doesn't mean that it shouldn't happen, but as we'll see, hopefully by the end, we're obviously not where we wanted to be 5 years ago, and it has really stuck the whole system of, I think, geopolitics up on its head. I don't profess to answer all these questions by the end. As most good discussions, I think we'll probably raise more questions than answers, but anyway, here we go. If you're looking at this area, I think the one thing, and it always behooves me to look more deeply, of the complexity and the diversity of this issue, of Syria, of the Levant, of this entire region, Because I think psychologically we try to compartmentalize. We try to say, okay, here we're going to figure out this religion and this sect and this race and this ethnicity and this, fill in the blank. But the reality usually is much, much more complex. As you can see here, cacophony of ethnic areas here that in the current aspect there we see of Syria. If you're looking at religious groups, and there's lots of religiosity that's overlaid with this entire debate, both domestically and internationally. If you're looking at refugees, if you're looking at xenophobia that Derek Jones will talk about later in the month, there's quite a bit of diversity, right? And how do you deal with that? We don't want to sugarcoat it. We don't want to overlay some of our prejudices. But the more that we can learn about the complexity, I think the better. The worst aspect, obviously, if you look at the human devastation in total, the UN estimated total, 250,000, and that just got us through December of this last year, just 2 months ago. Unbelievably unacceptable, and as a human rights scholar, Lisa Kretz was talking to her and Darren yesterday about, how do you deal with those ethical dilemmas of exposing students and all of us to these horrific aspects about our contemporary world without being stymied and shut down and depressed and say, screw it, I can't do anything. Scholars for Syria obviously is doing more than that. It's empowering. But I'll circle around at the very end and say this is really why we want to be seized on this region, on this issue, and on the humanitarian devastation. As we've seen, and actually we had with the UN group in the fall, there was a forum that talked about the refugee crisis, and I know there'll be a number of other lectures about that. I won't hit on that as much, but as you followed in the news over the last 3 to 6 to 9 months, it's just an incredible, incredible challenge for all involved. I'm not going to go back 300 or 400 years, so don't worry. But I'm thinking my historian colleagues are like, hey, you can't understand this in a vacuum. You have to understand the, the enormity of history. Well, I'm not a history, so we'll dance through relatively quickly here. And those that have studied this much better than I, you can correct me. But most of you know in terms of the Ottoman presence, if we would fast forward up to the 20th century, as some historians would say, the short history, Dr. Annette Parks always looks at me and says, who cares about political science? What's the relevance of politics? And I said, Annette, you study like the Middle Ages and hostages, and you're talking about relevance. And but we need to understand the ancient history, the contemporary history, and so Ottomans obviously played an inordinate role in this region and this period, up through at least the First World War, and then the after-war period. And we don't want to always place blame. And a lot of folks, if you're looking contemporarily, would say everything really rests on colonialism, right? The Europeans and later on the Americans, we screwed everything up. There is quite a bit of validity there, right? And indeed, the French were very prevalent in this area, which is contemporary Syria. And we saw there even in the 1920s and the interwar period. Here you can see both, in addition to France, the United Kingdom, Italy, Spain, many of these colonial powers having a fairly large footprint in this area. Okay? Again, not to say that we're blaming all the colonial powers for everything, but you have to keep that in the context in terms of how do we now in 2016 start to tease out what's going on now, and ultimately, while we're really here, is where do we go? How do we start to address and to solve some of these issues? Obviously, one of the key players here, anybody know who this is? Like students. Hafez al-Assad, and he came to the fore in the 1960s, 1970s. And he is a controversial figure, to say the least. And there's just a little quote there, what I thought was kind of interesting. And he would play a life-size role both in this region and throughout geopolitics until his death in 2000. Obviously, you can't think about the conflicts during this period without talking about the 67 war, the 73 war, and depending, and it's great to look at historians on what you call this, right? Are you looking at the Six-Day War? Are you thinking about the Ramadan War, the Yom Kippur War? Lots of land being moved back and forth here. Obviously, the role of Israel, but Syria was very much involved in both the 67 and the 73 war. Land occupied by Israel. After that, all the Sinai, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights, which is the most germane to our discussion tonight. Here with the 73 war, similarities solidified much of what we saw there in 67, but would set the stage for much of the political wrangling and debates, at least as it involves regional powers like Israel and Syria, Egypt, and others. The Lebanese Civil War, and you've probably been seeing a lot with refugees, played a pretty substantial role in this. And later on, we'll have some diagrams that try to follow the players here. Many of you may have followed the Civil War in Lebanon as it was occurring, but Syria was very much involved with them. As we've seen resurgent reports on Iran, right, with the nuclear agreement of recent days, and that tie from Iran to Lebanon and Hezbollah and Syria. And so there's a very, very strong connection here. But indeed, Syria was involved from the mid-1970s, almost at the outset of that civil war, up until the middle of this last decade. Well, for us, we think about, well, in the 1980s we had the Iran and Iraq War. Who did the U.S. back in that war? You remember? Iraq, right? I mean, there's pictures of Donald Rumsfeld shaking the hands of Saddam Hussein saying, this is great, right? Because the enemy of my enemy, well, must be my friend. Well, in 1979, right, we had the Islamic Revolution, and anything that could help stymie Iran, we were for. So here you got the Iran-Iraq War, a devastating war. Syria did back Iran, but this just complicated things. Indeed, complicated the U.S. role in this region. Okay. In 1981, Israel formally annexed the Golan Heights, and that has obviously been a very difficult bone of contention. If you ask, Israeli security personnel, they would say that, they have been threatened from its neighbors since the development of that country in the late 1940s, and they need so-called buffer zones. And the Israelis would say, hey, we were attacked. We ended up with some of this land. We're continually being bombarded, both literally and figuratively. But the annexation there of the Golan Heights obviously has played into the debate even up to this day. One of the biggest, and up until recently, even now, there's very little evidence in terms of photographic evidence, video evidence, anything. There's a few Western journalists that had access in the early 1980s in Hama with the uprising and the revolt, and indeed the enormously efficient crackdown by the Assad regime. It's hard to verify how many people were killed. Some would say 15, some would say 17, 20,000. There have been high estimates as 40,000 people were killed in this one area. I mean, the enormity of that is just, it's hard to comprehend. During that period of the 1980s, again, there was very, very little information coming out. And when you have a fairly authoritarian regime, you're able to keep that information pretty tight. But you've heard, even recently, in the last 3 or 4 years, people referring back to that, saying, hey, this idea of oppression and human rights violations, it's not just a new thing since the Arab Spring and the actual full-blown civil war that we've seen in Syria. This goes back decades and indeed generations. Well, what we used to think about, and it depends on who you're talking to, there's different types of Gulf Wars, right? Gulf War I, Gulf War II, depending on who, where you're originating. But here in 1990, the invasion of Kuwait by Saddam Hussein's Iraq, again, created quite a conflagration of opportunities and challenges for geopolitics. Herbert Walker Bush, achieved unbelievably high approval ratings during this, and many of y'all that were watching back, we only had 4 real channels then, and every night, if Vietnam had the TV trays where you're watching our men and women come back in body bags, this was one that was kind of a video war. We were seeing all these smart weapons, and we could actually watch this every night. It was horrific, but also just, I would say confusing, right? But even then, we, at least in the West and the U.S., we try to paint it as what's black, white, what's right, wrong, what's good and bad. If you compare it to, some of these that come later, you may say, hey, this was a relatively broad coalition, and indeed Syria did join the U.S.-led coalition against Iraq. You could say this is a blatant violation of international law, breaching the borders and the sovereignty of of Kuwait. But it would change the dynamics of what would be happening in this region for the subsequent decades. Well, in 2000, as we said, senior Assad, Hafez al-Assad, died, and his son assumed power. Shock, right? The Assad that we know now. And some would say, well, this is a change. It's young, and there was an idea that during this period that we were seeing older authoritarian leaders in the region stepping aside or dying or being acceded. And the younger group, again, you're thinking this is young. It's not unlike we're looking at domestic politics here. A younger generation, they're going to have different ideas. They're a little more open to other ways, perhaps Western ways. But very early on, it was apparent that this particular regime was going to be maybe not so much different. I apologize for some of the graphic. I use cartoons a lot in class, and this one I thought was just, very early on, people were saying, there were bloods on the hands of the senior side, and we're seeing very similar patterns of the successor here. Again, you may differ. We can have that debate toward the end of the hour here. Well, the U.S. was not going to sit on the sidelines. You may remember George W. Bush coming out and from the lectern saying, we're going to call out the axis of evil. And then they kept adding to it. They're like, okay, well, we're not going to stop with 3, let's just load it up. Right? And indeed, Syria and the younger Assad was added to that. They're saying, hey, this is a regime that the U.S. is not going to sit idly by and see devastation of his own people and destabilization of the region, intervention in Lebanon, et cetera, et cetera. Again, some would say, the invasion in Iraq, and we can debate that for weeks in terms of whether that was a ridiculously imbecilic U.S. foreign policy foray. Others would say, well, maybe this is true, that it put others on notice. I mean, even accusations of Libya, and Muammar Gaddafi, once he saw that, he's like, oh, Lord, we better really watch this thing about nuclear proliferation. The U.S. actually means business. Well, things kind of escalated. I mean, even though the war in Lebanon, civil war, had ended officially in 1990, there's lots of influence back and forth, again, with Iran, with Syria, with the internal politics of Lebanon, and the former Prime Minister Hariri was assassinated in 2005. And this, again, just rubbed kind of salt in the wound in terms of what were the regional geopolitics. And it really did Well, ultimately, I think many analysts would say it finally pressured Syria to remove its lingering troops that were still stationed and had been, again, since the mid-1970s, of saying that this is interventionist, it's really not promoting peace and stability in the region. And so the international community put added pressure on Syria, and indeed, those did withdraw in 2005. This was a fascinating occurrence in August 2007. You may remember in the 1980s, Israel had accused Saddam Hussein of trying to develop nuclear weapons, and allegedly they scrambled fighters and flew over to Osirak, bombed it, came back, and everybody said, "Did you see anything?" "I didn't see anything. Didn't see a thing." Well, fast forward to 2007, and intelligence was indicating that there could be weapons of mass destruction development, especially tied to North Korea and Syria. Once again, Israel allegedly scrambles fighters, goes across the border. If you look at the before and after, and the next day, folks were going in either with satellites or physically trying to go in and saying, "Hey, did this happen?" And it was posed to Syria saying, "Hey, did this happen?" Well, Syria doesn't say anything, right? Assad's not going to say, "You know what? That Israel came and bombed a nuke." Oh, no. I don't know. But it was amazing. I mean, there was nothing. I mean, it wasn't like there was tons of rubble. I mean, within 24 to 48 hours, the facility was clear, absolutely clear. Okay. Now, some would say that the U.S. wink, wink, nod, nod said, "Hey, this is a good thing. It's a way to keep nuclear proliferation in check, and it didn't have to at least physically, tangibly involve the U.S." But we keep talking about salt in the wound, right? It's just talking about, if we like international law, was that a violation of Syrian sovereignty? Purists would say, well, yeah, if you fly over and attack a sovereign country, that's virtually an act of war. You could say, fast forward, under the Obama administration, the Bush administration, even before, our use of drones, right? We use drones constantly. You say, is that a violation of international law? Some international law scholars would say, yeah, it sure is. But we kind of have evolved, if you can say that, or devolved, depending on your perspective there. Activities of the Assad regime, not only did you have the UN, but you also had the Arab League essentially leveling increasing sanctions on Syria. Okay? So making it more difficult for the average person. And there's a whole tomb of literature that kind of measures the efficacy of economic sanctions. I mean, does it really impact or obtain the outcome that you're really looking for, or does it harm the actual people that you're really trying to save to make lives better? You can say this in North Korea. We can look at that with Libya, with Syria. I mean, there's like I said, volumes of this. But there was quite a bit of consensus that the activities of the Syrian government were not conducive to international law and should be addressed, if not militarily, at least in terms of economic sanctions. Well, and you're not necessarily supposed to see this, it's just kind of a timeline here from the origins. And if you look up there, here we've got Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, Syria, Yemen. The protest that did spark that with Mohammed Bouazizi. And then it goes all the way from December of 2010 all the way up till today, essentially. And tries to just kind of see what has happened. And I think for most scholars and average citizens watching this, it's been terribly depressing, right? Because you think, well, we're kind of democratically aligned. We like democracy. We like freedom. We like self-determination. Hell, the UN puts it in its charter. We people should determine our own destiny, right? But that whole issue, as I talk about in class, of sovereignty is really challenging, right? When does sovereignty end and someone else's rights begin, right? Does a state that violates its own human rights, if they are unable or unwilling to protect and provide for their people, have they ceded their ethical and legal right to sovereignty? That's a tough one, right? You have these two competing ideas of saying, hey, the international community should intervene if and when a government cannot or will not provide basic human rights. It harkens back to my beloved Texas, right? The date is old, but when I left Texas, we executed more people than almost any country on the planet. Harris County in Houston almost sentenced more people to die than any other place in the country, right? So when Amnesty International is going around to try to visit human rights abusers, where did they stop first? Texas, right? So the point I'm making here is, what if the rest of the world said, hey, you, the United States, whether it's with, fill in the controversial blank, right? Capital punishment, abortion, whatever, right? Say, we don't think that you, the United States, is meeting the international standards, so we want to intervene. What would the U.S. say? No, hell no, right? And if you're Texas, they're reaching for their guns, right? And so it's easy for me, as a human rights scholar, to say, well, this is a violation of human rights. The international community should intervene. But the key is how? How do you intervene? It's very, very difficult. Some would say, and in this political climate, watch my clock here, with the political elections heating up, right? We just finished with Iowa. People are talking about Benghazi and what happened when we lost 4 U.S. Diplomats, and say, well, should we have intervened in Libya? Did we create instability? And as we're looking at Syria, as we're trying to tease out the complexities here, some would say, my God, why didn't the international community intervene in 2011? How about 2012? How about 13? How about 14? How about 15? But then you say, oh, wait a minute. How about intervening in Afghanistan in 2001? Or Iraq in 2003? And again, Hillary Clinton's having to answer to that, saying, hey, you voted for the invasion of Iraq in 2003. And you were Secretary of State when Benghazi went down. And she was like, well, foreign policy and diplomacy is complicated. And it is. It absolutely is. If we went around the room here, I guarantee we probably have as many opinions as we do have good folks sitting in these chairs in terms of what should be done. If you go down the list here, right, we haven't talked as much about Yemen, civil war going there, the geopolitics, because it's never, and I see my colleague, young Kim back there, who's a comparative politics expert, right? I do more international relations, so what's the difference? It's rare that those don't overlap, and you can talk about a civil war, right? War in between peoples within definable borders, but very quickly that tends to spill over, if not immediately, into international, if not full-blown intervention influences. And that is absolutely true with this entire region. Absolutely. Okay? So, if we like democracy, and if we think historically, one of the great political scientists who died just a couple of years ago, he wrote this great book, Sam Huntington, about order in Latin America in 1968. And I still dust that off occasionally. Students are like, really? 1968? I think it still has relevance. He said democracy is great. We can talk about all this democratization and the third wave of democracy and looking at Latin America. But he said orders are really important. And you see leaders argue this, right? We'd like to do that, but can't. We need some order. In this country, right? We're talking about, you got Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders talking about, we need a revolution. And folks are like, yeah, wait a minute. How much revolution do you want? How much order and stability do you want? Some you could use as a cover, right? If you're a dictator, you say, you know what, I'm interested in your security. That's the most important. If you look in this country, or in the UK, or anywhere that we've been dealing with terrorism over the last decade, the government has argued, we need to take away more of your civil liberties to provide you security. And we're like, yeah. After September 11th, we were emptying it out. I'm going to say, please, take our civil liberties. We don't want them. Just give us some security. Right? Is that okay if democratically you kind of give up the ghost? Maybe. Maybe. But in terms of democracy, let's assume that we like democracy. And I love democracy, right? But it's messy. You know, you don't just add water and say, there you go, self-determined. Self-government. If you don't have the civil infrastructure, the civil society, and most don't. I mean, we can complain about ours, right? And you just click on your news and you're like, oh my God, what a broken system. But we do have institutions of civil society that by and large keep us from killing each other. Well, unless you look at gun violence and all that. But theoretically, we're not engaging in another civil war, right? Well, if you look here in the Middle East and North Africa, it's not a great update, unfortunately. And here you can see in terms of just the chart here, and those are population at the onset of the Arab Spring. Democracy, whoa, I mean, God loved Tunisia, right? And they were even recipients of the Nobel Peace Prize recently of saying, hey, you're fighting a good fight, you're actually making it. Many of our other beloved colleagues, no. I mean, whether it's full autocracy, a mix, or in the case of Libya and unfortunately Syria, a failed state, civil war, a collapse of stability. And it doesn't, I'm not here to say, okay, you can have one or the other. You can either have stability or chaos. Back to the single case of Syria, should we have intervened? Do we intervene now? We had, here's a picture in Aleppo of the young members of the Free Syrian Army. And early on, the U.S. was like, hey, here we go. We got an opposition that we can back. Let's do it. But we won't do too much, right? Remember Iraq. Remember Vietnam. We don't want a quagmire. We don't want to be interventionist, right? In December 2012, you had a fairly broad base. I mean, you got the UK, US, France, Turkey, a number of Gulf states formally recognizing the national coalition, saying, hey, this really is the legitimate governance of Syria. Now, how much do we back that diplomatically, financially, militarily? And in our democracy, right, Congress is battling this and say, do we send in troops? Oh, God, we don't know. Do we send lots of money? How about weapons? We got lots of weapons, right? Who do you give them to? And as we saw in Iraq, right, we've got lots of weapons in Iraq, and then as we'll see here in a second, ISIS, ISIL, Daesh gets in, takes the weapons. Oh my gosh, we're actually funneling weapons to the enemy inadvertently. We didn't plan it, right? Just kind of chronologically going through here, Israel hits another strike there in Syria, and allegedly guarding against weapons that were on their way to Hezbollah. Again, you've got Hezbollah operating in Syria as well as Lebanon. But even this is up for debate, right? George W. Bush asked for democracy in the Middle East. We fought a war in Iraq, we're spreading democracy. Well, if you look at the Palestinian Authority, you look at the Palestinian territory, you look at Gaza. Gaza held an election, 2006, 7, and allegedly, freely, fairly elected, depending on who you look at, they elected the government. Hamas. Well, the U.S. State Department said, not that kind of democracy. That's a terrorist group. And they're like, you want a democracy? We got democracy, right? If you look at Egypt next door, right? The fall of their long leader, 30 years, right? Mubarak leaves, you get a relatively free and fair, and then some are like, oh, wait a minute, do we want that? Can we do that? Can we undo that? It gets really, really tricky. Again, both domestically and internationally. What is legal, what is ethical, and what is pragmatic? Okay? So, we wake up and there's all these new alphabet soup. ISIL, Islamic State in the Levant, right? The Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. Many are now moving towards Daesh, of saying that it doesn't give it the stature of an Islamic State. It kind of takes the, because many have said this is really not Islamic, right? It's almost counter, anti-Islamic. Okay, so you're even seeing Secretary of State Kerry and others, moving towards the term Daesh instead of ISIS or ISIL. But things are complicated even more, right? Some would say, well, if we'd intervened in 2011, 2012, we'd have a solution. Others are saying, well, now that we've waited too long, we've got this cacophony of resistance. And this was a big one. In fall 2015, Russia enters the fray, allegedly to fight terrorism, right? And to attack ISIS, ISIL, Daesh. And the U.S. is like, I don't think so. I think you're actually jacking it up for the other resistance groups that we support that actually might bring down an Assad regime. And they're like, we're just trying to help. We're just trying to help. We're really not trying to bolster the Assad regime. It'd be okay. We've been kind of public about it, but that's not what we're doing. We're humanitarian, right? Another aspect that came up, chemical weapons. The president draws a line in the sand saying, hey, we don't want to intervene, but if Syria engaged in chemical weapons or weapons of mass destruction, indeed, we would intervene. This was actually a pretty impressive, even though some complained about it and criticized, where the UN and the US and Russia got together and said, hey, we got to work this out. And they did in very short order, and by mid-2014, you actually did the impossible. You extracted these chemical weapons, VX and sarin gas, got it out of the country and destroyed it. I didn't think it happened, right? Now, some would say that that gave political cover, saying we're doing something, but people are still dying in Syria. Not chemically like they had been before, but we're still seeing devastation. And that was even before the most recent mass exodus of refugees. Well, the situation now, and you can see, and this is at the end of September 2015, this changes daily, right? Changes daily in terms of the mix of the different controlled territories. It's just a cataclysm. Here's just another example of that here added to the Russian presence. Oops, if I can get, there we go. The Russian presence here. And even that, right? Turkey comes in and shoots down a Russian plane. They're saying, hey, you're violating our airspace. A violation of sovereignty. Well, Turkey's a member of NATO. Do you invoke if you attack one, you attack all of us? I mean, so people are saying, my goodness, this really could develop into a much, 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 much larger conflagration. Here's just more details up until even just a couple of weeks ago of airstrikes, both U.S.-led coalition and Russian airstrikes. And the big question is, oh my gosh, you've got Russian planes up, you've got U.S., UK planes. What happens if you've got mistakes, right? Even if it's not intentional. This could really, really, really wreak havoc on what little stability there is in geopolitics. Okay, so bear with me on this one. It's, I don't know, it's like we were drinking, right? And we're like, hey, let's, but if you step back, I kind of like it because it takes all this complexity and it jams it into one chart. So if you're looking, let's say, okay, we want to see what's going on in Syria, right? So here you got the Syrian government, you got the rebel groups writ large, you got the Islamic State, which obviously is between Syria and Iraq, but wanting to be global, of course. Here you got the Iraqi government, Kurdistan, Lebanon, split between, again, government and Hezbollah, Iran, and we've already talked about Iran going through Lebanon, their influence there, and then influencing Syria, right? And vice versa. Did you see that going back and forth? Russia, finally, boom, right? They're coming in to save the day. Libya, oh God, it's a mess, right? Yemen, the Houthi rebels, and the Yemeni government. And you say, okay, the U.S., these states, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Egypt, Qatar, right? They're backing this. If you're looking, okay, who's helping the rebel groups writ large? You got the U.S., Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Qatar, Turkey. Okay? Egypt, oh boy, it's really complicated. And we don't have a couple of nights to talk about that one. That one's a fascinating one. But this at least gives us, I think, a little better sense of how does this all fit. The problem is you can't just say, okay, we're going to focus just on Syria. Right? You have to say, how do we focus on this? And this is just one really small chunk of real estate when you look at it. And so it's easy to say, well, this is right, this is wrong. This is black, this is white. And again, as a human rights scholar, I do think there is right and wrong. But if you're looking at diplomacy and you're looking at political realities, man, it's really, and I'm thinking like Dr. Kretz, right? I'm almost stymied going, that's it. It's too difficult. But I've got some of my students in the State Department, in NGOs, working in private corporations that are working and actually making a difference. So I'm still hopeful, but oh my goodness. So we look to the UN, right? That bastion of my students in the Model UN class, they're like, is this real? I mean, is the UN, can they do anything? It's completely broken. It's a train wreck. But it's the best train wreck we've got, right? So we bring in the UN, they're saying, we finally have all these people together, we're going to have a conference, we're going to Geneva. This time, we're going to have the peace. 48 hours into it, Monday, Tuesday, sorry, not going to work. And at the same time, you got people dying in Syria and the government making more incursions and people push away from the table. Even in the last 24 hours, you've got, over here, God love him, Staffan de Mistura, who's coming in, right? He's a special envoy for the UN for Syria. He's trying to get all these folks together. He thinks he's got it. God, back to the drawing board, right? Supposedly they're going to be back February 25th. I wish him well.